Good day to each and everyone. I am Rafina S. Batak and I am your topic presenter for today's presentation. Today, we will be discussing one of the most important concepts in educational psychology, which is the information processing theory. Have you ever wondered how our brains actually learn, store, and remember information? Well, just like a computer, our minds also have a system for receiving data, processing it, and saving it for the future use. In this video, we will be discussing the types of knowledge and how information move through different stages of memory, from sensory motor, or it is called a sensory register, to working memory or short-term memory, and finally to long-term memory. We will also look at how encoding, storage, and retrieval help us learn effectively. But before we delve into our lesson for today, let us know the learning objectives. So at the end of the lesson, the students will be able to describe the processes involved in acquiring, storing, and retrieving knowledge, and cite educational implication of the theory on information processing. Now, information processing theory is a cognitive theory that uses computer processing as a metaphor for the workings of the human brain. It is initially proposed by George A. Miller and the other American psychologists in 1950s. So the theory describes how people focus on information and encode it into their memories. Now let's discuss the types of knowledge. The first one is general and specific knowledge. So this involves whether the knowledge is useful in many tasks or only in one. So general knowledge can be applied to many different situations or tasks. For example, reading and communication skills. And specific knowledge, it is limited to one area or task. So for example, knowing how to fix a car engine. So the second one is declarative knowledge. So this refers to factual knowledge. This relates to the nature of how things are. They could be in a form of image or words. So declarative knowledge, it is a factual knowledge knowing what something is. So it deals with facts, concepts, and information that describes how things are. For example, knowing that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius or that Manila is the capital city of the Philippines. So the third one is procedural knowledge. So this includes knowledge on how to do things. It is knowing how to do something. So it's about the actions and the steps. So for example, knowing how to cook rice, solve a math problem, and ride a bicycle. Fourth one is episodic knowledge. So this includes memories of life events like your high school graduation. So episodic knowledge, this type of knowledge comes from a personal experiences or life events. So it's tied to emotions and memories. So for example, remembering your first day of school, a family trip, and your high school graduation. And last but not the least is the conditional knowledge. So this is about knowing when and why to apply declarative or procedural strategies. So this is knowing when and why to use certain information and skills. It helps you to decide which strategies or knowledge fits a specific situation. So for example, knowing when to use a formal language and casual language, or when to use a addition or multiplication in solving problems. Next is the stages in the information processing theory. So IPT involves the functioning of the senses, sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So senses, it is the starting point of information processing. So our five senses, the sight, the hearing, touch, taste, and smell, receives information from the environment. So the senses act as the input system, bringing raw data like sounds, images, or words into our brain. So for example, you see a picture, hear the teacher's voice, or feel the texture of an object. The second one is sensory register or sensory memory. So after the senses receives the information, it enters to our sensory register. So this stage briefly holds information for only a few seconds. So if you pay attention, the information move to the next stage, and if not, it is quickly forgotten. So for example, when someone calls your name and you notice it, your attention transfers it to the short-term memory. And the third one is the short-term memory, or it is called as working memory. So this is the stage where active thinking and processing occur. So the information that we pay attention from the sensory register, it enters to the short-term memory. So the short-term memory can hold information for about 15 to 30 seconds and has a limited capacity about 5 to 9 pieces of information. So to keep the information here longer, we need to rehearse or repeat it. So for example, repeating a phone number to remember it longer enough to type it in. And lastly, we have the long-term memory. So long-term memory, if the information is understood, organized, or rehearsed in the short-term memory, it is stored here permanently. So the long-term memory has no limit and can be stored information for a lifetime. So it includes the knowledge, the experiences, and the skills. So for example, remembering how to ride a bike or your birthday for even after many years. Next is the primary stages in the information processing theory. So the first one is encoding. Information sensed, perceived, and attended to. So encoding, this is the first stage of information processing. So it occurs when information is sensed, perceived, and attended to by the learner. So encoding allows the brain to convert what we see, hear, or experience into a form that can be understood and stored in memory. For example, when you read a lesson and focus on its meaning, your brain encodes that information for learning. And the second one is storage. Storage information is stored for either a brief or extended period of time. So once information is encoded, it moves into storage, where it is kept for a brief or extended period of time. So this stage determines how well and how long information is retained, either in a short-term memory or it is temporary, or in a long-term memory or it is permanently. For example, you might remember a friend's phone number for a few minutes or recall your birthday for a lifetime. And lastly, we have the retrieval. So information is brought back at the appropriate time and reactivated for use on a current task. So this is the final stage where stored information is brought back and reactivated when needed. So retrieval allows us to apply what we have previously learned to new or current tasks. So for example, when you recall a formula during a math exam or remember a cooking recipe while preparing a meal. Now let's discuss the three main stages in the memory process. The first one is sensory register or sensory memory. So the sensory register is the first stage in the information processing model. So it acts like a temporary filter that receives all the information coming from our senses, like what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. However, the information stays for only a very short time unless we focus our attention on it. So we have the capacity. So our mind receives a great amount of information, but it is more than what our minds can hold or preserve. So our sensory register can receive a large amount of information at once, but our brain can only process a small portion of it. Most sensory data fades away almost instantly if we don't pay attention. Next is the duration. So the sensory register only holds the information for an extremely brief period in the order of 1 to 3 seconds. So there is difference in duration basis on modality. Auditory memory is more persistent than visual. So in the sensory register, it only holds information for only 1 to 3 seconds before it disappears. So the duration varies depending on the type of senses. So the auditory or hearing memory lasts slightly longer than the visual or the seeing memory, which fades more quickly. So the rule of attention. So the rule of attention, the attention acts as a gatekeeper in the process of information processing and memory. So although our senses are constantly bombarded with information, we only perceive and remember the things that capture our attention. So before attention is given to something, the information exists as the pre-categorical information, meaning it has not yet been recognized or understood by our brain. Once we focus our attention, the information is perceived, allowing us to categorize what it is, judge its importance, interpret its meaning, and store it in a memory for the future use. So the second one is short-term memory, STM, or working memory. So the short-term memory is the second stage in the information processing model. It is where the information that has been attended to and temporarily held for immediate use or processing. So the capacity of the short-term memory can hold to 5 to 6 chunks of information at a time. So a chunk can be a single item or a group of related information. So for example, remembering a phone number, and also the duration of the STM lasts about 18 seconds or less before it fades away, unless we make an effort to make it. So the maintenance rehearsal, it prevents the information from disappearing. So we use maintenance rehearsal, which means repeating the information over and over, like memorizing a line or repeating a number until you write it down. And last is the long-term memory or LTM. So the long-term memory is the final and most permanent stage in the memory process. So the information that is rehearsed and processed deeply in the short-term memory can be transferred to the long-term memory for the long-term storage. So we have here the capacity and the duration. So the capacity of the long-term memory has an unlimited capacity, meaning we can store a vast amount of knowledge, skills, and experiences throughout our lifetime. And the duration of the long-term memory is indefinite. So memories can last for days, years, or even for a lifetime. So depending on how meaningful or well rehearsed the information is. Next is the executive control process. So it involves the executive processor, or what is referred to as metacognitive skills. So the executive control processes is a higher level cognitive function that involves the executive processor. Also, it often associated with the metacognitive skills. So the ability to think about and manage one's own thinking. So these processes are crucial for effective learning and problem solving. So because they help regulate how information is handled in our brain. So there are the key functions for executive control processes. So number one is guiding the flow of information. So it directs on how information moves through the cognitive system. And also it determines what information to focus on, what to store in the memory, and what to discard. And lastly, decision making and learning. So it helps the learner to make informed decisions about how to categorize, organize, and interpret informations, and also to support strategies for understanding complex materials, planning tasks, and monitoring progresses. Forgetting. Forgetting is the inability to retrieve or access information when it is needed. It's a normal part of how memory works, but it can happen for the different reasons. So we have two main ways in which forgetting likely occurs. So we have the decay and interference. So decay, it occurs when information is not attended to or used over time. So the memory fades away naturally if it is not reinforced. And the reinterference, it happens when other information block access to the memory you are trying to recall. So it can be a retroactive. It is a new information interferes with the old. Or the proactive, the old information interferes with new information. Next is the methods of increasing retrieval of information. The first one is rehearsal. So repeating information verbatim, either mentally or aloud, to reinforce the memory. So the second one is meaningful learning. So connecting new information to prior knowledge to give it significance. The third one is organization. So structuring information by making connections among different pieces to help recall. So the fourth one is elaboration. So adding extra ideas or linking new information to what you already know. So making it more meaningful. Next is the visual imagery. So visual imagery, creating mental pictures of information to strengthen your memory. Next is generation. So generation, it is producing or creating information to yourself to make it easier to remember than the information you only hear or read. And next is the personalization. Personalization, making the information personally relevant to yourself, improves retention. And lastly, we have the context. So the context, it is to remembering the situation or environment in which learning occurred can help retrieve the information. Also, we have other memory methods. The first one is serial position effect. So you are more likely to remember the beginning or the primacy and the end or the recency of the list than the middle. And the second one is part learning. So break information into smaller chunks or segments to make memorization easier. Next is we have the distributed practice. So distributed practice spread learning over multiple sessions instead of cramming all at once. So it also helps improve the long-term retention. Last is the mnemonic aids. So it uses tools like acronyms, rhymes, or visual cues to make information easier to retain and retrieve. And lastly, let's tackle about the information processing model. So the information processing model explains how human processes, restore, and retrieve information. So it is often compared to a computer system. So describing the steps involved handling information from the moment it is perceived until it is stored or forgotten. So here's an overview of the model. So the first one is sensory input. So the information from the environment is received through sensory organs. So for example, the eyes and ears. So this sensory information is briefly held in sensory memory, where some details may be lost if not attended to. So the second one is the attention. Attention, it is selective attention, focuses on specific sensory inputs, so transferring relevant information to short-term memory for further processing. And also, we have the short-term memory, also known as working memory. So it temporarily holds the processes information. So unattended information can be lost here, and unprocessed information can be forgotten. So rehearsal keeps information active. And also we have the encoding. Encoding, the process of converting short-term memory into a long-term memory for more permanent storage. So it is effective. Encoding enhance retention. And also we have the maintenance rehearsal. So the maintenance rehearsal, it is repeating information to keep it active in the short-term memory. So helping in encoding it into the long-term memory. Also, we have here the retrieval. So the retrieval, it is accessing stored information from a long-term memory when needed. So some information may be lost over time if not retrieved or rehearsed. And also, lastly, we have the long-term memory. So the long-term memory, the storage of the information over extended periods. So it can be retrieved back into short-term memory when needed, but may weaken or be lost over time. So this model helps understand how humans process and remember information, emphasizing the importance of attention, rehearsal, and effective encoding for memory retention. And that wraps up our discussion on the information processing technology. We've learned that learning doesn't just happen instantly. It's a process that involves receiving information through our senses, processing it in our working memory, and storing it in our long-term memory for the future use. By understanding how our mind processing information, we can design a better ways to study, teach, and to remember. Whether it's through focusing our attention, organizing information, or practicing retrieval. Every step plays a vital role in effective learning. Remember, the key to mastering information is not just to store it, but to understand and apply it. Thank you for watching. I hope you've gained valuable insights into how our minds learn and process information. Until next time, keep learning and keep growing.